Tell me, do you bleed? You will. Oh yeah? Well, at least I don't go around fighting crime dressed up like my one fear. Your one weakness is a rock.
What is up, everybody? RandomRandomMan here. I am back in this familiar setup to be reviewing the highly anticipated film Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, which stars Ben Affleck, Henry Cavill, Amy Adams, Jesse Eisenberg, Diane Lane, Lawrence Fishburne, Jeremy Irons, Holly Hunter, and Gal Gadot, and is directed by Zack Snyder. By the way, there will be no major spoilers given here. You're all safe, as the plot basically follows the events that occurred during the destruction of Metropolis during the previous film, Man of Steel. As Bruce Wayne / Batman, played by Ben Affleck, out of fear in knowing what Superman, played by Henry Cavill, is capable of, Batman decides to take on the Man of Steel himself head-on in preventing any further destruction around the world. Meanwhile, however, there is another impending threat to both of these beings in the form of Lex Luthor, played by Jesse Eisenberg. Going into this movie, I was excited, as many comic book fans are, as this is the very first time we get to see Batman and Superman on screen together in a live-action adaptation. I mean, I'm wearing this shirt. I love these two characters that much that I am representing my absolute admiration for them. And before this film even came out, there was a lot of hesitancy, to say the least, in how this movie was going to be approached. In talking about that, I actually liked the previous movie, Man of Steel, by the same director, Zack Snyder, quite a bit, although I fully acknowledge that it does have its fair share of problems, which I feared somewhat would apply to Batman vs. Superman. However, there's a lot of things that are going to happen with a production like this, and a lot of things will happen during the actual film. How was it? Let's run down the whole thing. Starting off with the returning cast members from Man of Steel, Henry Cavill continues to do a good job portraying Superman himself. Now, it goes without saying that it is impossible to compare Cavill's performance as Kal-El to Christopher Reeve's portrayal of the iconic character, because they're both really different interpretations of how the characters are portrayed in film. As of course, Man of Steel did set up a darker version for Superman to be shown on screen. Amy Adams is just lovely to watch on screen in just about anything, and I think she has a lot more to do as Lois Lane, the love interest of Superman, of course, and she has a lot more initiative and action to take part in, and she's not just regulated to being a damsel in distress the whole time. And I also really enjoy Lawrence Fishburne as Perry White. Now let's move on to the new players. Ben Affleck as Bruce Wayne / Batman. I thought he was utterly stupendous in the role. I personally have always had faith in this actor as soon as he was casted in this role, and after seeing his superb performance in Gone Girl, it only backed up my opinion in that not only would he be a more than sufficient Batman, but he would be an excellent Bruce Wayne. Just the emotion that he had throughout the entire movie and how broken this character was with his extensive history, and just the grit he brought once he was in costume, I thoroughly enjoyed that. Jeremy Irons as Alfred, tremendous. Now, this is a sufficiently different portrayal of the character than we had with Michael Gough and even Michael Caine in previous movies, as this is a more visceral, very raw Alfred. Holly Hunter, I thought, was another nice addition as a senator. She had a really powerful scene during one sequence of the film, and Gal Gadot as Diana Prince / Wonder Woman. Like Affleck, I've always had faith in her as this character, as I've seen her performances in the 4th, 5th, and 6th Fast and Furious movies, and she handled action well, and during the action scenes in this movie where Wonder Woman is present, she is phenomenal. Now we have Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor. Unlike Affleck and Gadot's casting, I thought Eisenberg was stunt casting, and I said to myself that he could have portrayed a social networky type portrayal of this character, as he was utterly superb in that film, but he was distracting. He was so fidgety, jittery, just all around shaky in the role, and it looked like he was 2 seconds away every time he did outbursts from spontaneously combusting. It just felt like he was doing his best Riddler or Joker impression. I don't think we need that for this type of character, as he is Lex Luthor. Now, I understand that this character is a different version of Lex Luthor as it is explained in the film, but I just could not help but say to myself, that's the Riddler or that's the Joker, and we don't need that. If we already have the Joker being portrayed by Jared Leto in this universe in Suicide Squad this August. So overall, most of the acting in this movie was pretty well done, save for that one exception I had with Eisenberg. Story-wise, this is where we get into the really nitty-gritty with this film, as this movie is titled Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. And it's pretty much exactly what we get with a movie with that title. However, the way it is approached and how it is written is very questionable. Actually, scratch that. Not very, but extremely questionable. To me, this movie felt like it was two films smashed together into one, as the first part of this film just has to do with Batman versus Superman, just the rivalry between these two characters, and the emergence of the Justice League. Now, for the first hour of this movie, I was actually really into it. It felt like we were actually getting some answers after Man of Steel, with the ramifications during the destruction of Metropolis, and even with some development with some of our characters, most notably Bruce Wayne / Batman. The second half, though, after one key moment in the film, I thought this movie just fell and fell and fell. It felt like this movie had a lot to do, and this was mostly attributed to the writing once again. Chris Terrio and David S. Goyer were hired to write this movie, and it felt like they were trying to stuff everything they possibly could with it. What do I mean by this? Well, there's a lot to say in how the movie is edited too, along with the writing. As in the first half of the film, it's pretty sufficient, but as the movie keeps going throughout the second half, I had no idea what was going on with how the movie was cut together. It felt like scenes were dropped in, scenes were going out of nowhere. It felt weird in how it didn't feel seamless entirely, and the construction of the movie was just inconsistent throughout. Granted, the pacing is another big problem. The first half of the movie, once again, I was very into, but once the second half hit, you really started to feel the 2.5-hour running time. And it makes me more interested, but also hesitant to see what's going to happen with this rated R cut that is going to be attached to the Blu-ray to the film, as it is 3 hours. It felt like this movie just wanted to be set up at times for future films. There is one prime example I will always go back to for that. The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now, I fully acknowledge that in my original review for the film, I gave mostly positive thoughts to it, but upon further recollection, it seemed like that movie was more concerned with trying to get itself made as set up for future films, but not be a cohesive narrative in its own right later on. And that's what a lot of this movie feels like. If you've seen that one trailer for this movie, it pretty much tells you where it's going through and through. Which brings me to how the Justice League were implemented into this movie. It felt super forced. It happens out of nowhere. It could have happened at the very end, but it just felt obligatory to the filmmaker to just throw it in there and just feel like, hey guys, remember the Justice League movie is happening next year. We want you to be aware of it, but it'll fly over some people's heads if they're not rooted in this universe. I don't think this movie is for kids, not because it's excessively violent or anything like that, but they'll get super bored because of how off the pacing is. The action in this movie is actually very well done. Now, that actual fight with Batman and Superman, I thought it was a good fight, but nothing great. It felt half the time very one-sided in how it was even approached because, again, with the very incoherent writing, it just felt phoned in. But with the one fight scene that involves Batman in a warehouse, I thoroughly enjoyed Batman kicking some genuine ass. It reminded me of some of the video games, including these two, the Batman Arkham games, as he just mows down suckers and throws down some really nice moves. Now, If you're a Batman purist, and I'll go a little bit more in depth later, you'll see that Batman is a killer. He is an undisputed killer in this movie. I didn't mind that. I just wanted to see how different this interpretation would go, as it felt visually stunning as well to see Batman fight. The visuals everywhere else, like with the effects, the production design, the cinematography looks nice. Basically, this is just like any other Zack Snyder movie on a visual level. His movies are really very eye-catching because of how he approaches this like a comic book film. I also have to briefly mention the sound design in this movie, because one review that I've read said that this movie can be summed up in one word: loud. I really don't want to sound like an old geezer here, but I thought this movie was loud too. I personally have a hearing disability, but I really don't want to sound like this is an actual problem, but it's noticeable that some of the sound effects and the bolstering design and how it booms everywhere just made me go, ah! This also goes with the original score. Now, Hans Zimmer and Junkie XL composed the music for this movie, and it was, I guess, very noticeable and nice how these two were able to compose a score for this kind of film, but it's not one of their more significant or one of their more standout scores like they have done in the past. There's a lot of scenes that just feel like it's pandering to die-hard comic book fans just because they're there and they'll get their seal of approval for this movie, but there's also just moments that didn't feel like they were necessary. There are nightmare sequences that involve Batman in this film, and they felt like they could have just been cut out. It could have significantly reduced the running time, and even with the ending of this movie, this movie felt like it had multiple different endings. Not just setting up the next movie, but just how it concluded. It goes back to the editing of this movie and how just sloppy it felt. Now, I was going to mention something else with Batman, and yeah, again, purists of Batman are not going to like that he's a straight-up killer in this movie, even though I personally enjoy the action scenes with him. But it also goes with how some moments in this movie involving Batman, despite me enjoying them, could have been cut down. There are nightmare sequences that threw me off guard, and they could have been significantly cut out, and just how the movie ends. I'm not going to get into spoilers again, spoiler-free review, lost for words. But what this movie does during its final moments, with that one thing that was spoiled in one trailer, it just felt so phoned in and shoehorned into the movie just to have a last chance of getting your attention, because this movie threw me off throughout. There is a ballsy move that this movie does with how it ends this part of the storyline, and while I actually really was a fan of that, just like with the controversial moment at the end of Man of Steel, what ruined it was the multiple endings that this movie had. It just makes me disappointed not only in how the current state of this movie is, but just in how franchises are going to continue on. My final thoughts on this movie are that in the past 2 years, I have been consistently reviewing movies on this channel. This has been the most difficult movie I've ever had to really digest and think about. I really enjoyed most of the acting. Some of the action sequences look nice. It's a visually stunning movie. But on the other hand, the plotting and the structure with the pacing of the movie just really just left me at a loss for words, because it just really wasn't well done. Man of Steel was already very controversial, and this film is certainly controversial in my eyes as well. For those comic book fans out there, again, you will enjoy this movie in getting what you want to see with the action and just the characterization of these people on screen. If you're a regular moviegoer or just someone who has been following this series, I'm going to give this a very cautious recommendation to you, because on the one hand, you'll see a lot of brilliance, but on the other hand, you'll see a mess as well. As for me, I did mostly enjoy it for what it was, but I will admit, like Man of Steel, it is incredibly flawed. My final verdict for Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice is 3 out of 5 stars. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment on what you thought of Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. Please keep the comments as spoiler-free as I have given this review. Subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll catch you on the next movie review.